In this video, we'll finally be listing the notes that we have generated through our Firebase database and then render it into our homepage. And we'll be introduced with a new kind of library that is usually used for fetching data or for posting any data to any endpoint, which is called Axios. Now, Axios is HTTP request making library, and I've added this using the Yarn package manager. You can also see some examples over here, but this is already added in my boilerplate, so you can just see the whole thing in action through this tutorial. Now head over to the Bootstrap documentation and navigate to the list group view. Here you'll see a configuration of how to add lists. So if we basically add these classes, we can render lists without having any additional styling. Now go to your code. You'll notice that we have an index.html file which has the Bootstrap link style sheet already linked up. So we don't need to do anything to set up Bootstrap. It's already there in my boilerplate. So head over to the home component and we just get rid of this, all of this. Now just copy this code snippet and then paste it in your component. Let's see how this looks like. This has dummy data already in it, so let's just see how it renders. Right, so it renders nicely, but we want it to be somewhere in the middle. So let's add a container to it. So let's add a class of container. Well, I don't think we need to add anything because Bootstrap already has a built-in container class. Right, so now it's somewhere in the middle, and then we can loop through and add our nodes that we have rendered. So let's just go to our index and see that we have something called service.list. So basically, it's a service is a file that we'll be using where we will list all of our API endpoints. So if we navigate to service, we have a dummy endpoint added to it. Let's replace it with our API endpoint, which is the noted endpoint. So if you just copy this, paste this here, we should get our list. Now let's rename this as well to node service and rename this file. And here, this already gets renamed, but this doesn't. So now let's look at the data that we get because of this node service. So let's just console log this and see if the data is something that we can loop through in our list. Moving on to our app, opening the console. So we get an object, right? So in that object, we have ID and we have the description and title. So we need to format it in such a way that we can follow the general schema. So it will be a list of objects. So in order to do that, first, let me just get rid of this error that I'm getting because of the class, because class attribute doesn't exist in JSX. We'll replace it with class name. Now we want to format this data before we even be able to loop through it. So let's add a function called format notes. Here we'll have the notes data, and then let's just add an array that will be our final result. Now we'll just iterate through our nodes using a for loop. So let's add for const key value of object dot entries. This is a very handy function in JavaScript built in, where we can just iterate through a key value object, and we have the key and the value. So we want to assign value.id equals to the key. So we'll have an ID attribute in the value because right now value has only title and description. And then we want to push this value in our array. And then finally return this formatted notes. So let's call this notes. And the notes will have format notes, the data. Let's just console this formatted data and see if we got this right. Now hop onto your browser and yes, so you'll see we have an ID, title, and description. So it's just a flat array of objects. Now all we need to do is render this here. How do we render this? We basically just destructure the notes from the state will basically map through it. So note, and then we have the key, which will the note.id. And here we'll just write down the title. Awesome. So we are now rendering the notes, but let's beautify this a little bit so we can show it in a proper, we can show it in a bigger font and everything, and we can also show the description as well. So in order to do that, paste it again, and then we'll add a div with a class name of flex. Now this is all in Bootstrap's documentation to add what kind of a flex box you would want and if you want justify content or anything. But let me just add this for now. And then inside the div, we have an h5 tag. And then inside and after the div, we'll have another div to render the node.description. Awesome. Now let's see how this looks like. Great. So we have a nice looking notes right now. Let me just add a little bit of design to this by adding a heading to it. And we'll have h1 tag. And inside that, we'll have the app's name, which is noted. Great. So we have a nice heading inside. So we're basically done with we're basically done with rendering the list of notes. In the next video, we'll be diving into creating the notes from our UI.